This event occurred on a summer evening. My mother was driving, with me in the front seat, my twin sister, and my little brother in the back. We were on our way to our family's cabin in western Maryland, a 4-hour drive from our Pennsylvania home. At the time, Cass and I were 12, and my brother was fast asleep in his booster seat. Camping in western Maryland was our favorite family activity, so we were all very excited, including my mother. However, the car ride was always a challenge. The heat was unbearable, with no air conditioning, and we didn't have smartphones back then. So, the few music stations we found on the radio that weren't playing religious gospel and our idle conversation were our only sources of entertainment. More often than not, Cass and I would gaze out the window, creating stories about the people we saw and their destinations. When we passed truckers, we'd try to get them to honk their horns, which was always a fun interaction when they obliged. That's when our troubles began. Cass and I were early bloomers, and by the age of 12, we already looked a bit older, attracting the attention of older men, much to my mother's annoyance. About 2 hours from our cabin, I made eye contact with a trucker and signaled him to honk his horn.
He smiled and immediately obliged, which made me smile back.
However, he didn't stop staring and driving alongside us. He had noticed Cass behind us, and unfortunately, he decided he liked what he saw. I didn't fully understand some of the gestures he was making at the time, but they were inappropriate, and my mom noticed. She told me to keep my eyes down and not encourage him by continuing to look. My mother tried to slow down so he would pass us, but he matched our speed, staying level with us. My mother sped up and forced her way in front of his semi-truck, but he moved into the slow lane and sped up to match us. This continued back and forth. No matter what my mother did, he remained next to us. There were so few cars on the highway that we couldn't escape him. I glanced over, and his seat was raised enough for us to see his inappropriate behavior, though we didn't fully understand it at the time. My mother, however, did. At this point, my mother flipped the man off, but the smile on his face only grew wider. As we approached a section of the road with 2 lanes and a steep drop-off, the trucker aggressively cut us off and ended up in front of us. We were in a remote area with no cars in sight, and the right lane was against the mountain, while the left was separated by a safety railing and a steep drop down the mountain. The road was getting more winding as it started to get dark. The man was going slowly now and repeatedly swerved into the left lane, causing my mother to try to pass him. However, he stayed close, forcing her inches from the guardrail. Cass and I were screaming in terror, our brother waking up and crying, and my mother had a death grip on the steering wheel, panic in her eyes. The trucker kept swerving into our lane, clearly enjoying the fear he was causing. My mother slammed on the brakes, and we swerved right, almost colliding with the mountain. We stopped, angled toward the mountain, and my fear peaked, thinking we might fall off backward. After 3 attempts of backing up and pulling forward, we managed to get back into the right lane, going no more than 30 miles per hour. I was prone to car sickness, so I grabbed the plastic bag in my seat. Cass and I couldn't control our fear, and our mother was trembling, but she finally managed to get us back into the right lane. We drove in silence until we reached the last stop before our cabin, about 45 minutes away. It was a small, remote gas station, but it served its purpose. We cleaned up, and I brushed my teeth in the dim bathroom. As we left, now in complete darkness, my mother mentioned that the police in that area were notoriously unhelpful, and cell reception was non-existent. We drove in silence the rest of the way. When we got to the cabin, Cass and I tried to discuss what had happened, but our mother shut us down. She assured us it had nothing to do with us, and we should not be bothered by a grown man's inappropriate behavior. She built a campfire got stoned, and sent us to bed while she relaxed outside. We were just relieved that we had survived the terrifying encounter, and to this day, driving and being near semi-trucks still triggers anxiety. After that evening, we never attempted to get truckers to honk at us again. I used to be an over-the-road, OTR truck driver who drove with another guy. This job only lasted a year, but during that time, I had some strange encounters on the road. One of these encounters involved another truck driver who made me question my career choice and ultimately led me to leave it behind. The interaction happened at night. We were driving a load down to California, set to arrive the next day. I had arrived at a rest area in Arkansas around 3:30 a.m., just finishing my drive time and preparing for a 10-hour break. It was dark, with light rain falling, and the rest area was a bit secluded, nestled among trees and located a bit away from the highway. The setting was eerie, and it set the stage for a chilling encounter I was about to experience. I clocked out for the night, quickly scanning my surroundings. I noticed a man sitting on one of the benches, smoking a cigarette in the dark. Walking past him, I couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy, but it wasn't enough to set off alarm bells. I continued towards the restroom to take a break. After handling my business and washing my hands, I headed back to my truck. The man was still seated on the bench, but his body language indicated he was now watching me. His face remained shrouded in shadows due to the dim lighting, but his whole body turned to track my movement as I walked past. This made me slightly paranoid, and I quickened my pace to get back to my truck. I hopped inside and locked the door, thinking the worst of my anxiety was behind me. I decided to turn the radio back on, finish one of the comedy shows I was listening to, and enjoy some beef jerky I had bought earlier. As I raised the jerky to my mouth, my peripheral vision sensed movement. I looked up at the benches, but the man was no longer there. Instead, he was now standing underneath a light post about 10 feet from my truck.
My anxiety surged, and something about his posture sent chills down my spine.
I couldn't shake the feeling that this man had bad intentions. I shut the radio off and stared back at the guy. He didn't move, and the shadows still concealed most of his face, but it was evident he was fixated on me. The prolonged stare down felt like an eternity, and he didn't even lift his arm to take a drag from his cigarette, which was still lit. Feeling that the situation was growing increasingly strange, I called out to my co-driver, who was sleeping in the cab. What, dude?" he said, still groggy from sleep. "Hey man, I finished my shift, but this guy is staring at me outside the truck," I replied. My co-driver moved about and peeked through the cab curtain. "What guy?" I looked back, and the guy was gone. I panicked and scanned all around, and when I checked the driver's side mirror, I saw the man slowly walking towards the back of the truck, cigarette in his mouth. "Looks like he's walking around the truck," I said. "Really? What side is he on?" my co-driver asked, confused. The guy had circled the back of the truck and was now walking up the passenger side. "He's on the passenger side now," I said. I slid over to the passenger side, grabbed my knife from the dashboard, just in case, and my co-driver finally saw the man walking up in the passenger side mirror. The man stopped right by the passenger door and started peering into the lower window. For those who don't know, semis tend to have a window on the lower part of the passenger door, so drivers can see if any cars are in their blind spot on that side. Feeling considerably freaked out, I yelled, "What the hell do you want?" This made the man leap back and step on his tiptoes to try and peer into the higher window, where he could see me looking at him. He appeared to be in his 50s or 60s, a skinny man with a bright, bug-eyed, and deranged look on his face, a mix of confusion and malice. My co-driver said, "Can we help you?" Upon hearing that there were two of us in the truck, the man abruptly straightened up and walked off, leaving us both as confused as ever. My co-driver threw on his clothes and sat in the driver's seat, and I recalled my experience up to that point. We just sat and watched the man. We noticed that every time a new vehicle arrived, he would walk to the nearest light post and stand there. We sat for about 30 minutes, debating whether we should call the police, but this guy hadn't done anything besides acting like a creep. When we finally decided to make the call, we watched the man check his phone, shake his hands in frustration, and then sprint back to one of the cars in the parking lot, peeling off into the night. That was the last time I ever saw him. What confuses me the most is his intentions. I was larger than he was, so if it came to an altercation, likely he'd only have the upper hand if he had a weapon. What was he doing out at 3:30 a.m. in that shady rest area? My best theory is that rest areas aren't often watched by the police, and this one happened to be out of view due to the tree coverage between the rest area and the highway. It seems like this guy picked that spot for that particular reason. As for his plans afterward, abduction, theft, violence, I'm not sure. This night occurred about 7 years ago, and to this day, it still haunts me. This story happened 7 years ago when I was 22. I had just moved into my first apartment, and I was the first in my family to leave our small, sleepy town. Every Sunday, I visited my family for dinner, did my laundry, and headed back to my apartment, which was about a 45-minute drive up the highway. This particular night, there was a summer thunderstorm. I left my parents' house at around 10 p.m. in the pouring rain. This was the first time, after moving away from home, that I encountered something truly terrifying. However, I kept this incident to myself due to my pride. Everyone had been giving me a hard time about living alone as a single woman in a new area. As I was driving down the service road that led out of town and eventually merged with the highway, I approached a train loading station, which had always given me the creeps. If a train was crossing the road to load, you'd be stuck there for a while. After crossing the tracks, the road turned into 2 lanes and ascended a steep hill. Approaching the quarry, I noticed the orange lights on a red cab 18-wheeler in the quarry parking lot. The heavy rain and poor visibility made it challenging to spot the trucker until I was quite close. As soon as I saw the trucker pull out onto the road, I had to slam on my brakes to avoid hitting the trailer. I skidded and nearly lost control of my car. The road was treacherous, and my headlights were already on. However, this trucker swerved into my lane right in front of me, and I had to change lanes to avoid colliding with him. My anxiety was already high because the road had flooded due to the rain, and I had almost wrecked once. The trucker continued driving in the middle of the 2 lanes as we approached a steep hill. Eventually, he moved to the right lane, which relieved me. I switched lanes to pass him, and as I passed the front of the truck, he abruptly swerved behind me, flashing his high beams and honking the horn. I checked my headlights, which were already on, and it confused me. I signaled and moved to the right lane to get out of his way. He followed my lane change and started laying on the horn. I made 2 more lane changes, for a total of 3, trying to stay out of his way. However, he continued tailgating me, high beams and horns still blaring. My anxiety was overwhelming, and I was in tears. I couldn't understand what this guy wanted. My headlights were on, so why was he acting like this? I was scared to speed up because I knew the road had flooded shoulders and random spots in the middle of the lanes due to the heavy rain, which made it treacherous. I realized there was nothing between that quarry and the highway but about 4 or 5 miles of woods. If I wrecked, it would be just him and me. This terrifying situation continued for the next 5 miles until we reached the highway. I finally floored it, and he couldn't accelerate fast enough to keep up. I had lost him, and I was relieved. As soon as I realized I was safe on the highway, I was a hysterical wreck. There was only one exit after getting on the highway, leading to a small town the highway passed through. Beyond that, there was nothing but woods for a good 30 minutes. I contemplated taking that exit to calm down, but my desire to get home quickly took over, and I sped right past it. In hindsight, I should have stopped. Once the city was no longer visible in my rearview mirror, I began to calm down, and the rain lessened to a drizzle. There weren't many other cars on the highway, and most of them were trucks. I was cruising along in the center lane when a truck in the passing lane next to me started blaring its horn and swerved into my lane, forcing me over to the third lane. I quickly changed lanes in front of him, and then slowed down to align myself with the front cab. I took out my phone and used the camera to snap pictures of the cab. The flash made the driver realize what I was doing, and he started slowing down until he was behind me again. I was satisfied that I had managed to get some pictures, but was still quite angry at this point. I pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway and waited for him to pull over. I just wanted to get behind him to capture a picture of his license plate and report this incident. Regrettably, the driver was onto me. I noticed headlights behind me a long way back, but on the shoulder of the highway. I waited and watched as the truckers passed me by to ensure I didn't miss him. Suddenly, I noticed a shadow pass through the truck's headlights, which spooked me. Did he get out of the cab? I didn't stick around to find out. I took off and got home as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, the pictures I had taken were a total failure due to the drizzle and the flash. I could see the red cab, but no matter what filters I used, I couldn't make out what the cab said. This was a harrowing experience that still haunts me to this day.